It is one of those peculiarities of memory that certain nights in London refuse to fade, no matter how many years pass or how many cases crowd one's recollection. The winter of 1889 is, for me, a catalogue of fog, coal smoke, and the muffled rhythm of hansom wheels upon wet cobblestones. Yet even among those dim recollections, there remains one evening that stands apart with unsettling clarity the night the first whisper of what would become known as the case of the strange echo reached Baker Street. I had returned to our rooms at 221B rather later than usual, having spent the afternoon attending to a minor surgical consultation in Kensington. The air was thick with that peculiar London dampness which clings to one's overcoat and seems determined never to release it. As I stepped into the familiar sitting-room, I found Holmes in his habitual position. Stretched out in his armchair, his long fingers steepled before him, and his eyes fixed upon the ceiling with an intensity that suggested he was reading invisible text written upon the plaster. A violin lay idle upon the table beside him. The instrument, I noted, bore the faint sheen of recent use, though the bow was already returned to its case. "You are late, Watson," he remarked without shifting his gaze. "I had a patient whose spleen proved more troublesome than anticipated," I replied, removing my gloves. "Nothing serious, but enough to detain me." "Ah," said Holmes, "the spleen again. A most underappreciated organ in the literature of medicine, yet remarkably ungrateful in practice." He said this last with a faint trace of amusement, though whether at the organ or my profession I could not determine. I had scarcely seated myself when there came a sharp knock upon the door. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps were heard ascending the stairs with unusual haste, followed by a brief hesitation outside our door. Holmes rose instantly, as though the knock itself had been anticipated long before it occurred. "Come in," he called. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Hudson visibly disturbed. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "He insists it is urgent. Says it concerns—" Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "A sound," he repeated softly. "How delightfully vague." Before I could respond, a man stepped into the room. He was of middle age, dressed in a dark travelling coat whose edges were still damp from the fog outside. His hat was clenched tightly in his hands, twisted almost beyond recognition. But what struck me most was his expression, a mixture of fatigue and something deeper, something akin to dread that had settled permanently upon him. "I am Mr. Elias Morton," he said. His voice was controlled, though it carried a tremor beneath the surface. "I have been advised that you, Mr. Holmes, are the only man in London who will not dismiss me as mad." Holmes gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Madness," he said lightly, "is a word often employed by those who lack sufficient data. Pray sit down, Mr. Morton, and begin at the beginning." The man obeyed, though not without hesitation. I observed that his eyes flickered constantly toward the window, as though he expected something or someone to be watching from the fog beyond. "It began 3 nights ago," he said, "in Russell Square. I was returning from a late appointment at the office. The streets were unusually empty, unnaturally so. Even the lamps seemed dimmer than usual." Holmes interlaced his fingers. "Atmospheric impressions are rarely reliable," he said. "Proceed with facts." Mr. Morton swallowed. "There were no facts at first, only a sound." "What kind of sound?" I asked, unable to restrain my curiosity. "Here," Morton hesitated. "That is the difficulty, Dr. Watson. It was my own voice." A silence fell over the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "I heard myself," Morton continued, speaking words I had not yet spoken. Not an echo in the ordinary sense. There was no wall, no alleyway to reflect sound. I was alone in the street. "You are certain you spoke nothing at that moment?" Holmes asked sharply. "Absolutely certain." I had not opened my mouth. I confess I felt a slight unease at this point, though I attributed it at first to the late hour and the quality of the fog seeping through the cracks of the window frame. Morton went on. The voice was ahead of me perhaps 20 paces. It repeated my own footsteps as well, but always slightly out of sync, as though anticipating me. When I stopped, it stopped. When I walked, it walked first. Holmes rose abruptly and crossed to the window. He stared down into Baker Street, where the gas lamps burned with subdued halos in the mist. "And you did not report this to the police?" he asked, without turning. "I did," Morton replied. "Inspector Lestrade humoured me at first, but when I returned the following night, it happened again. Again? And worse." Now Morton's hands were trembling openly. "This time," he said, "the voice was not merely repeating me. It began speaking sentences I had not yet thought. I felt an involuntary chill pass through me. Even Holmes turned slowly at that. "Give an example," he said. Morton hesitated, then spoke in a lower voice. "I was walking past the fountain in Russell Square. I remember thinking that the water was unusually still. A moment later the voice ahead of me said, 'The water remembers before it falls.'" Holmes's expression did not change, but I observed a slight tightening around his eyes. "And you are certain those were your thoughts?" "I am certain I had no intention of forming those words. They came after the voice spoke them." For several seconds Holmes remained silent. Then he returned to his chair and sat down with deliberate calm. "Interesting," he said at last. That single word, spoken in Holmes's measured tone, had the effect of making the room feel both larger and more oppressive at once. "What did you do then?" I asked. "I ran," Morton admitted. "I fled the square and did not stop until I reached my lodging. I did not sleep that night, but I could still hear it, faintly, as though it had followed me." Holmes steepled his fingers again. "And the third night?" Morton's face darkened further. "The third night," he said, "it spoke my name before I had even left my office." At this, even I felt the absurdity of the situation giving way to something more disquieting. A man might imagine voices, certainly, but anticipation, foreknowledge, suggested something beyond ordinary hallucination. Holmes rose once more. "Mr. Morton," he said, "I require one thing above all, honesty without embellishment. Do you believe you are pursued by a person, a mechanism, or an illusion?" Morton looked at him helplessly. "I do not know," he whispered. Holmes turned slightly toward me. "Watson," he said, "you will accompany me." "Now?" I asked. "Now," he replied. Morton stood abruptly. "You believe me, then?" Holmes paused at the door. "I neither believe nor—"
This audio was created with async.com.
"Believe me, then?" Holmes paused at the door. "I neither believe nor disbelieve," he said. "At present I only observe that your case is either extremely simple or extremely dangerous." And with that enigmatic statement he reached for his coat. The fog outside had thickened considerably by the time we stepped into Baker Street. Gas lamps glowed like distant suns trapped in wool, and the street itself seemed to dissolve only a few yards beyond where we stood. Holmes walked ahead without hesitation. "Tell me, Watson," he said after a moment, "what is the one thing that distinguishes an echo from an original sound?" "It is secondary," I replied. "It follows the source." "Precisely," said Holmes. "And yet our client describes something that precedes him." We walked in silence for a time. At length I said, "You do not think he is mad?" Holmes's reply was immediate. "I think," he said, "that madness is rarely capable of such precise timing." We reached Russell Square shortly thereafter. The park was deserted, its iron gates looming like skeletal sentinels. The fountain at its center stood still, dark, and almost mournful in the fog. Holmes stopped at its edge. "Here," he said quietly. Morton's breathing grew shallow behind us. "This is where it began," he whispered. Holmes knelt slightly, examining the ground. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting indeed." "What is it?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though listening not to the square, but to something beneath it. When he spoke again, his voice had altered slightly. "There are sounds," he said, "that do not travel through air alone." And then, from somewhere ahead of us in the fog, a voice spoke, unmistakably human, and it said, "Dr. Watson, you are late." I felt my blood turn cold, for I had not spoken, nor had Holmes, and yet the voice had used my name with perfect familiarity. Holmes, however, did not move. Instead, he smiled faintly into the fog. "Well," he said softly, "this is no longer a question of madness." He stepped forward. "It is a question of method." And with that we ventured deeper into the mist. The words that rose from the fog in Russell Square did not merely reach my ears, they seemed to settle inside my mind with an unnerving familiarity, as though they had been waiting there already formed, only requiring permission to be spoken aloud. "Dr. Watson, you are late." I confess I stood motionless for several seconds, my rational faculties struggling to assert themselves against the immediate instinct that some unseen figure had stepped out of the mist and addressed me directly. Yet there was no figure, only fog dense, shifting, alive in its own sluggish way, and the dim glow of gas lamps struggling to assert their authority over the night. Holmes, however, reacted in a manner that was almost worse in its restraint. He did not start, nor did he demand explanation. Instead, he took a slow step forward, as though the voice had been no more than an expected appointment kept. Morton, by contrast, gave a low, involuntary sound in his throat and stepped backward. "No," he whispered. "That is impossible. It cannot." Holmes raised a hand slightly without turning. "Do not contaminate observation with fear, Mr. Morton," he said calmly. "Fear is notoriously imprecise." Then, turning his head slightly toward the fog, he spoke. "Whoever is present," Holmes said, "you will find that theatrics are wasted upon me. If you intend communication, I suggest clarity over dramatics." There was no response, only silence. But it was not the ordinary silence of an empty park. It was something heavier, as though sound itself had been momentarily discouraged from existing within the square. I stepped forward to Holmes's side. "Did you hear it clearly?" I asked in a low voice. "Yes," he replied. "And more importantly, I noted the absence of delay." "The absence of delay?" I repeated. Holmes nodded slightly. "A true echo requires reflection. Reflection requires time. Even in the most favorable conditions, sound must obey distance. Yet that voice arrived with no perceptible lag between stimulus and reception." He turned his gaze toward the fountain. "Which suggests," he continued, "that either the source is exceedingly close," he paused, "or the conventional model of sound propagation is not applicable here." Morton laughed nervously. "That is impossible," he said. "Sound is sound." Holmes glanced at him. "Is it?" he asked softly. We moved slowly into the square. The gravel beneath our feet was damp, softened by the persistent moisture of London's winter. The fountain stood ahead like a darkened eye, its basin filled with water that reflected nothing but fog. Holmes circled it once without touching it, his eyes scanning the ground with surgical precision. I observed that he paid particular attention to the edges where stone met earth, as though expecting some subtle irregularity to reveal itself. After a moment he crouched and touched the stone base lightly with his fingertips. "Watson," he said. "Yes?" "Do you notice anything unusual about the ambient acoustics?" I listened carefully. At first I detected nothing beyond the expected hush of fog and distant city movement. But then gradually I became aware of something subtle, a distortion, not of sound, but of its absence. Certain directions seem to swallow noise more readily than others. "It feels uneven," I said finally. "Precisely," Holmes replied. He rose again. "Sound behaves here as though the environment has been selectively edited." Morton stared at him. "That is absurd," he said again, though less convincingly than before. Holmes did not reply. Instead, he began walking slowly toward the far side of the square, where the fog grew denser and the outlines of benches and shrubs blurred into indistinct forms. We followed. At approximately 20 yards from the fountain, Holmes stopped abruptly. "Here," he said. I joined him. The ground here was slightly different, softer, less compacted. Holmes bent down and brushed away a thin layer of damp leaves. What lay beneath made me pause. A small metal fixture, partially embedded in the soil, no larger than a coin but clearly man-made. It had a faint perforated surface, like a crude mesh. Holmes studied it closely. "A conduit," he murmured. "For what?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he rose and looked around the square with renewed intensity, as though reassessing everything he had previously assumed. Morton approached cautiously. "That was not there before," he said. Holmes glanced at him. "You are certain?" "Yes," Morton replied quickly. "I pass through this square regularly. I would have noticed." Holmes interrupted him. "People rarely notice what does not demand their attention," he said. "That is precisely why such installations are effective." He turned slightly toward me. "Watson, consider this. If one wished to transmit sound in a controlled manner across a fixed area without obvious origin, how might it be achieved?" I thought for a moment. "Mechanical amplification?" I suggested. "Too visible. Hidden speakers of some sort?" "Possibly," Holmes conceded, "but still bound by known electrical constraints. No, what we are observing is more subtle than that." He tapped the metal fixture with his boot lightly. "This is not merely a receiver," he said. "It is part of a network." Morton looked increasingly pale. "A network of what?" Holmes straightened. "That," he said, "is precisely what we are here to determine." A sudden gust of wind moved through the square, shifting the fog momentarily. For a brief instant, the far side of the park became visible, and I saw something that made me instinctively step back. Standing perfectly still near the opposite bench, it was indistinct, blurred by the mist, but unmistakably human in shape. "Holmes," I said sharply. He turned instantly. The figure did not move. Then, slowly, it raised its head and spoke. This time the voice was not directed at me. It came from everywhere at once. Observation incomplete. Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw his eyes narrow slightly. Then he did something I did not expect. He smiled. "Ah," he said quietly, "so there is a counter-observer." Morton grabbed my arm. "We must leave," he hissed. "This is madness. We are being watched." "No," Holmes corrected him calmly. "We are being studied." The figure in the fog took a step backward, and then another, and then, impossibly, it dissolved into the mist as though it had never been physically present at all. Silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence. It now felt. Holmes turned away from the fading point where the figure had stood. "Watson," he said, "you will recall that in certain experiments in acoustics, it is possible to create the illusion of voice projection from multiple directions using controlled reflection surfaces." "Yes," I replied cautiously. "This," he continued, gesturing broadly at the square, "is no natural reflection environment." He pointed toward the fountain. "And yet sound is being manipulated as though it is." I looked at him. "Then you believe someone has constructed this deliberately?" Holmes nodded. "Not only constructed it," he said, "but refined it." Morton's voice broke in again. "Why me?" he asked desperately. "Why am I hearing?"
This audio was created with async.com.
Voice broke in again. "Why me?" he asked desperately. "Why am I hearing it?" Holmes turned to him slowly. "That," he said, "is the most important question you have asked since entering Baker Street." He paused. "And I intend to answer it." For a moment none of us spoke. Then Holmes added quietly, "But not here." He turned sharply. "Watson, Mr. Morton," we returned to Baker Street. As we left Russell Square, I could not shake the sensation that the fog itself was moving with intention behind us, not dispersing, but observing. And though no further voice spoke, I was uncomfortably aware of a lingering presence in the air, as though something unseen had taken note of our departure. Holmes walked ahead, his stride unchanged, yet I could see in the set of his shoulders that something had shifted. He was no longer merely investigating a mystery. He was, I realized with a growing unease, responding to it. And whatever this echo truly was, it had now acknowledged us in return. We returned to Baker Street in a silence that was not merely absence of speech, but the sort of deliberate quiet that follows an encounter in which words feel inadequate and even dangerous. The fog clung to our coats as though reluctant to release us, and I noticed that Mr. Morton, who had begun our journey with the appearance of a man seeking explanation, now bore the expression of one who feared that explanation might prove more unsettling than ignorance. Holmes, however, walked with the same steady pace as ever. If anything, his composure had sharpened. The faint abstraction that often accompanied his deeper musings had vanished. In its place was a focused intensity I had seen only in the most intricate of cases. Once inside our rooms, Mrs. Hudson was dismissed with gentle assurance, and the door was secured. The gas lamps were lit, though Holmes insisted upon lowering them slightly, leaving the room in a subdued half-light that seemed more appropriate to thought than comfort. Morton remained standing near the center of the room, as though uncertain whether sitting might anchor him too firmly to a reality he no longer trusted. Holmes, by contrast, moved directly to his desk. "Sit, Mr. Morton," he said at last. Morton obeyed slowly. I took my usual chair by the fireplace, though I confess my attention was divided between Holmes and the uneasy rhythm of Morton's breathing. Holmes produced a small notebook from his coat and opened it without ceremony. "Let us begin again," he said. Morton blinked. "Begin again?" "Yes," Holmes replied. "Your account thus far is contaminated by fear, and fear is a poor archivist of fact. We shall reconstruct events systematically." He looked up. "You first experienced the phenomenon in Russell Square. You believed you heard your own voice ahead of you." "Yes," Morton said quietly. "And subsequent occurrences followed a similar pattern of predictive speech?" Morton hesitated. "Yes. Sometimes movement, sometimes phrases I had not yet formed." Holmes nodded once, as though confirming an internal hypothesis. "Interesting," he murmured. He tapped the edge of his notebook lightly. "Watson, note this carefully. We are not dealing with simple auditory duplication." "I had already suspected as much," I replied. Holmes continued. "Duplication implies reflection. Reflection implies delay. Yet Mr. Morton's experience includes anticipatory elements. Therefore either time is being manipulated which we shall set aside as improbable, or cognition is being intercepted prior to articulation. Morton looked at him blankly. "My thoughts are being read?" he asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly. "Let us not leap to conclusions," he said. "There are intermediate possibilities." I found myself increasingly intrigued. "Such as?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "Subvocalization detection," he said. "Muscular micromovements associated with speech planning. Certain experimental devices in telegraphy have already demonstrated the feasibility of intercepting pre-verbal intention." Morton shook his head. "That is impossible. I would have felt some sensation." "Not necessarily," Holmes interrupted. "Most physiological processes of thought are imperceptible to the subject." He paused. "But that alone does not account for spatial displacement of voice." He rose and began pacing slowly. "Which brings us to the second anomaly, directional inconsistency. The voice is not merely predictive, it is spatially aware." I frowned. "Meaning?" Holmes stopped and turned. "Meaning," he said, "that it does not simply replicate Mr. Morton's thoughts. It positions them." A silence followed this statement. Even I found it difficult to immediately grasp its implication. Morton broke it first. "I don't understand." Holmes regarded him with a calm, analytical gaze. "Nor should you," he said. "The system you are describing is not one designed for understanding. It is designed for control." He returned to his desk and opened a drawer, retrieving a folded sketch of Russell Square. I recognized it as one of Holmes's rapid observational diagrams. He laid it flat before us. "Observe," he said. The sketch was annotated with precise markings: fountain, pathways, benches, tree lines. But now Holmes added several small dots connected by faint lines. "What are those?" I asked. "Hypothetical nodes," Holmes replied, "based on acoustic irregularities we observed earlier." Morton leaned forward reluctantly. "You are mapping the square?" he asked. "I am reconstructing it," Holmes corrected. "As an engineered environment." A chill passed through me. "Engineered?" I repeated. Holmes nodded. "Yeah. The presence of that embedded metallic fixture is not isolated. It implies a distributed system." He tapped the paper. "Multiple points, likely concealed, forming a lattice capable of modulating sound transmission." Morton shook his head slowly. "But why me?" he repeated again. "Why would anyone construct something like this and direct it at me specifically?" Holmes looked at him for a long moment before replying. "That," he said quietly, "is the only question that currently lacks sufficient data." Then, unexpectedly, he added, "But I do not believe you are the target." Morton stiffened. "Then who is?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and looked down at Baker Street. For a brief moment he said nothing. "I believe," he said at last, "you are the instrument of observation, not its subject." I felt a subtle unease at this phrasing. Morton looked even more disturbed. "I don't follow you." Holmes turned. "Consider the possibility," he said, "that the system is not merely responding to you but using you as a transmission medium." I frowned. "That would require constant proximity," I said. "Not necessarily," Holmes replied. "If the system is reactive rather than fixed, it may require only initial calibration." Morton stood abruptly. "This is absurd," he said sharply. "I am a respectable clerk in a commercial office. I have no enemies, no involvement in any scientific nonsense, nothing."
This audio was created with async.com.
Holmes watched him calmly. "Respectability," he said, "is not a shield against involvement. It is often merely a lack of awareness." Morton paced the room now, agitated. "You are saying I am part of something I do not understand?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Precisely." At that moment a faint sound interrupted him. Not from outside. From within the room. A subtle, almost imperceptible repetition. Holmes froze. So did I. It was Morton's voice, but Morton had not spoken. The sound came again. "Do not understand," this time clearer, not echoing from walls, not reflected. It was as though the room itself had remembered the phrase and chosen to replay it. Morton stumbled backward. "No," he whispered. "No, I didn't." Holmes raised a hand sharply. The room fell instantly still. Holmes stood very slowly. His gaze moved across the walls, the ceiling, the corners, each detail examined with renewed urgency. Then he spoke softly. "Watson." "Yes?" "Do you recall any structural irregularities in this room?" I hesitated. "No," I said. "None that I can recall." Holmes nodded once. "Precisely." He moved toward the wall behind Morton's chair. And then he did something I did not expect. He struck the wood lightly with his knuckles. A hollow sound responded. Morton turned sharply. "What is that?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he pressed his ear against the wall. A long silence followed. Then Holmes straightened. "I believe," he said quietly, "that our case has just become considerably more intimate." He turned to me. "Watson, fetch your revolver." Morton stared at him. "Why?" Holmes looked at him with a calm, almost detached seriousness. "Because," he said, "whatever is producing the echo," he paused, "is no longer confined to Russell Square, and for the first time since the case began, I saw something like genuine caution enter Holmes's expression. Not fear, but recognition, as though the mystery had stopped being distant observation, and had begun instead to answer back from inside the room itself. Morning in Baker Street arrived with a grey reluctance, as though even the sun found little pleasure in piercing London's perpetual veil of soot and fog. Yet despite the hour, sleep had visited none of us. Mr. Morton had remained seated in the same chair through the night, his posture gradually collapsing into exhaustion, while Holmes had spent the greater part of it pacing, observing, and occasionally falling into long stretches of silent calculation. I, too, had remained awake, though in a lesser capacity scribbling notes, reviewing Morton's account, and attempting to impose medical reasoning upon a phenomenon that increasingly resisted it. By dawn, Holmes had already formed his decision. "We go to Scotland Yard," he said abruptly. Morton, who had drifted into a fitful half-sleep, startled awake. "To Scotland Yard?" he repeated. "To Lestrade," Holmes corrected. "And more importantly to the records." I rose at once. "You believe they will have encountered something similar?" "I believe," Holmes said, adjusting his coat, "that if a system of this nature exists, it will leave statistical residue." Pattern. Complaints dismissed as hysteria. Reports filed under nervous delusion. He glanced at Morton. "And I suspect Mr. Morton is not the first to experience it." Inspector Lestrade received us in his usual manner, a mixture of professional courtesy and restrained skepticism, as though every visit from Baker Street arrived with an implied challenge to his department's competence. "Holmes," he said, rising from his chair, "and Dr. Watson, to what do I owe this early disturbance?" Holmes did not waste time. "I require access to your recent unsolved or dismissed complaints involving auditory hallucination reports in central London." Lestrade frowned. "That's a rather broad category." "Then narrow it," Holmes replied calmly. "Unexplained auditory perception without external source, preferably within the last fortnight." Lestrade sighed and reached for a file. "You've been reading too many philosophical treatises," he muttered. "I have been reading none," Holmes replied. "I prefer direct evidence." The inspector opened a ledger and began flipping through pages. After a moment he stopped. "Well," he said slowly, "there is something odd." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Go on." Lestrade turned the ledger toward us. 3 separate reports, different districts, all within 10 days. Same description, more or less. I leaned forward. The entries were brief, almost dismissive in tone. Subject reports hearing own voice preceding speech while walking alone Whitechapel. Man claims auditory duplication of thoughts while crossing Westminster Bridge. Dock worker alleges voice responding before verbalization near Limehouse. A strange heaviness settled in the room. Holmes studied the entries without blinking. "Dismissed?" he asked. Lestrade shrugged. "All classified as nervous exhaustion or alcohol-related hallucination. Nothing actionable." Holmes tapped the ledger lightly. "May I borrow this?" "You can copy it," Lestrade said cautiously. "But Holmes, what exactly are you suggesting?" Holmes closed the ledger. "That London," he said, "is developing a habit of speaking before it thinks." Lestrade gave a short, humorless laugh. "That sounds like half the politicians in Parliament." Holmes did not smile. "This is not metaphorical. We left Scotland Yard shortly thereafter, and it was only once we were back in the carriage that Morton spoke again. "I don't understand any of this," he said weakly. "Those men, they weren't connected to me. How could it be the same thing?" Holmes sat opposite him, calm as ever. "That," he said, "is precisely why I brought you." Morton blinked. "Why me?" Holmes adjusted his gloves. "Because," he said, "you were not chosen at random. You were selected as a stable reference point." I frowned. "A reference point?" Holmes nodded. "Consider, multiple unrelated individuals report similar phenomena, yet only one case escalates to structured attention. Yours." Morton shook his head. "I don't see what makes me special." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "That is exactly why you are suitable." The carriage jolted over a cobblestone unevenly, and for a moment the silence inside deepened. Then Holmes added, "Tell me, Mr. Morton, do you recall any unusual event preceding your first experience in Russell Square? A visit, an installation, a conversation, anything out of the ordinary?" Morton hesitated. "I told you," he said. "I work in a commercial office. Routine accounting. Nothing unusual." Holmes watched him carefully. "Routine environments," he said, "are often where
This audio was created with async.com.
Watched him carefully. "Routine environments," he said, "are often where anomalies are most effectively hidden." Morton looked frustrated. "I am not hiding anything." Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he leaned slightly forward. "Very well," he said. "Then let us consider another possibility." He paused. "That you are not the origin of the phenomenon, but its endpoint." Morton stared at him. "The endpoint?" Holmes nodded. "A receiver. A point at which something else becomes audible." I felt a slight unease at this interpretation. "You are suggesting," I said slowly, "that Morton is being used as a kind of transmission conduit." Holmes inclined his head. "Not consciously," he corrected. "But structurally, yes." Morton's face had gone pale. "I don't understand," he said again, more quietly now. Holmes leaned back. "That is because," he said, "you are still assuming individuality of cause." He gestured slightly. "This is not a single actor, Mr. Morton. It is a distributed system." The carriage slowed as we approached Baker Street. Holmes continued, "And distributed systems require architecture, which means—" He paused. Back in our rooms, Holmes immediately laid out Lestrade's notes beside Morton's account and his own sketches of Russell Square. He aligned them with meticulous precision across the table. Then, without looking up, he said, "Watson, what do you observe?" I studied the materials. "The incidents are geographically dispersed," I said, "but temporally clustered." "Good," Holmes replied. "And?" he prompted. I hesitated. "And they all involve auditory preemption, speech or thought occurring before execution." Holmes nodded once. "Exactly." He tapped the table. "This is not random hallucination. It is structured interference." Morton sat rigidly in his chair. "Interference with what?" he asked. Holmes finally looked at him directly. "With cognition prior to articulation." A silence followed. Then Holmes rose and walked to the window. Outside, Baker Street moved in its usual rhythm, carriages, pedestrians, fog, but something about it now felt subtly altered, as though the world had become slightly less certain of its own timing. Holmes spoke without turning. "There is only one conclusion consistent with all observations thus far," he said. I waited. Morton whispered, "What conclusion?" Holmes turned slowly. "That whatever we are dealing with," he said, "does not originate in speech." He paused. "It originates in observation." A knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered nervously. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "He insists he is expected." Holmes frowned slightly. "Did he give a name?" Mrs. Hudson hesitated. "He said," she replied, "that you would recognize him before he arrived." Holmes went still. For the first time since the case began, I saw something shift in his expression. Not surprise, not fear, but calculation accelerating into something sharper. He spoke quietly. "Send him in." Morton whispered to me, "Who is it?" I did not answer, because at that moment I realized something deeply unsettling. Holmes was no longer reacting to the mystery. He was anticipating its responses, and whatever had begun in Russell Square had now learned how to knock on Baker Street's door. The man who entered Baker Street carried with him no dramatic appearance, no theatrical pause, no suggestion that he was anything other than an ordinary gentleman caught in the machinery of London life. Yet it is often such men who unsettle Holmes the most, for he has frequently remarked to me that the extraordinary hides itself more convincingly in the ordinary than anywhere else. He was of middle height, clean-shaven, and neatly dressed in a dark overcoat that still bore the faint dampness of morning fog. His manner was composed, almost apologetic, as though he had interrupted us on a matter of trivial inconvenience, rather than been summoned by something that defied explanation. Holmes regarded him without speaking. The silence extended just long enough to become noticeable. Then the man smiled faintly. "Mr. Holmes, I presume," he said. "You presume correctly," Holmes replied. "And Dr. Watson," he added, glancing toward me with polite acknowledgment. I nodded in return, though I confess my attention was already fixed upon Holmes. There was something in Holmes's stillness that suggested a subtle shift had occurred, an internal adjustment, as though a piece of a larger pattern had just clicked into place. The man removed his gloves. "My name is Dr. Alistair Venn," he said. "I was told you would be expecting me." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Were you?" he asked. Venn smiled again, but this time the expression carried a faint trace of uncertainty. "That is what I was informed," he replied, "by a messenger this morning." Holmes said nothing for a moment. "What exactly did this messenger tell you?" Venn hesitated. "That you were investigating a phenomenon involving auditory displacement." At this, Morton shifted uneasily in his chair. Holmes remained perfectly still. "And did this messenger identify themselves?" "No," Venn replied. "They simply said I would be relevant to your inquiry." A faint silence followed. Holmes walked slowly around the table, his gaze never leaving Venn. "Dr. Venn," he said at last, "what is your profession?" "I am a physicist," Venn replied. "Or rather, I was attached to the Royal Society's Experimental Acoustics Division." At this I noticed Holmes's expression sharpen almost imperceptibly. Holmes repeated. Venn nodded. "The department was dissolved 6 months ago. Funding withdrawn. And yet," Holmes said softly, "you remain involved in acoustics." "Privately," Venn admitted. "Research does not cease merely because institutions lose interest." Holmes stopped directly opposite him. "That," he said, "is often the most dangerous form of research." Venn frowned slightly. "I beg your pardon?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward Morton. "Do you recognize this man?" he asked. Morton shook his head quickly. "Numero. I have never seen him before." Holmes then looked at me. "And you?" I examined Venn carefully. "No," I said, "I do not believe so." Holmes nodded once. "Interesting," he murmured. Then he returned to Venn. "Dr. Venn," he said, "please sit." Venn complied. Holmes took his own seat, steepling his fingers in his characteristic manner. "You are, I presume, here because of Russell Square," Holmes said. Venn blinked. "Russell Square?" Holmes's eyes sharpened slightly. "You were not there?" "No," Venn replied. "I came here because I was instructed to meet you." Morton suddenly interjected. "This is absurd," he said. "None of this makes sense." Holmes raised a hand. "On the contrary," he said calmly, "it is beginning to make a great deal of sense." He leaned forward slightly. "Dr. Venn, have you ever heard of a phenomenon in which auditory perception is decoupled from spatial origin?" Venn hesitated. "In theoretical terms," he said slowly, "yes. It has been hypothesized in relation to distributed acoustic fields." Holmes nodded. "And have you ever attempted to construct such a field?" Venn stiffened. "No," he said quickly. "That is purely theoretical. The energy requirements alone." Holmes interrupted him. "Would be considerable," he agreed. A pause followed. Then Holmes rose and walked to the fireplace. "Watson," he said without turning, "do you recall the embedded fixture we observed in Russell Square?" "Yes," I replied. "And its perforated structure?" Holmes nodded slightly. "That was not a passive device," he said. "It was a node." He turned. "And now we have confirmation that similar principles are known within experimental acoustics." Venn looked increasingly uneasy. "I must insist," he said, "that I am not involved in any active project of that nature. My work was theoretical only." Holmes regarded him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Dr. Venn, when you received your instruction to come here, did anything about it strike you as unusual?" Venn frowned. "Only that it was urgent." "And the wording?" Venn thought. "It was precise," he admitted. "Unusually so. It referenced your name directly and instructed me to expect recognition." Holmes nodded. "And yet," he said, "you have never met me before." "No," Venn confirmed. Holmes turned slightly toward me. "There," he said softly, "is our hidden clue." I frowned. "I do not see it." Holmes returned to the table and picked up Lestrade's ledger. "Watson, what is the common feature in all prior reports?" "That the subject hears their own voice before speaking," I replied. "Yes," Holmes said. "But more importantly," he tapped the ledger, "they all believe the voice is theirs." A silence followed. Morton looked confused. "But that is what it is, isn't it?" he asked. Holmes shook his head. "No." He placed the ledger down carefully. "It is only interpreted as that."
This audio was created with async.com.
He placed the ledger down carefully. "It is only interpreted as theirs." A faint tension entered the room. Holmes continued, "The true mechanism is not duplication. It is attribution." Venn leaned forward slightly. "I do not follow," he said. Holmes looked at him directly. "If a system can generate speech ahead of cognition," he said, "then it can also generate ownership of that speech." A pause. "In other words," Holmes said quietly, "it can make you believe you thought what it already decided to say." Morton went pale. "That is impossible," he whispered. Holmes's gaze did not waver. "And yet," he said, "you have experienced it." Morton said nothing. Holmes turned back to Venn. "Dr. Venn," he said, "I believe your role is not that of participant, but of architect, however indirectly." Venn's voice rose slightly. "I have told you I am not involved." Holmes interrupted him again, more sharply this time. "No," he said. "You are involved whether you intend it or not." A silence fell. Holmes walked to the window. Outside, London continued its indifferent motion. Then he spoke again, more quietly. "The hidden clue," he said, "is not the sound itself." He turned. "It is the certainty of recognition." I frowned. "Recognition of what?" Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "Of authorship." He looked directly at Morton. "Tell me, Mr. Morton," he said, "when you first heard the voice in Russell Square, did it feel like an intrusion or a continuation?" Morton hesitated. Then, reluctantly, "A continuation," he admitted. Holmes nodded slowly. "Exactly." A long silence followed this. Then Holmes said, "Someone is not merely transmitting sound in London." He paused. "They are writing thought into the minds of others and waiting for it to be spoken back." The room seemed colder after that statement. Even the gas lamps appeared dimmer. Holmes turned once more to Venn. "And you, Dr. Venn," he said quietly, "are either the origin of that design," he paused, "or the first man to hear it speaking back to him." And for the first time since entering Baker Street, Dr. Alistair Venn did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Holmes with something very close to fear. Not fear of accusation, but fear of understanding. The effect of Holmes's words upon Dr. Venn was immediate and unmistakable. The man who had entered our rooms with polite composure now sat rigidly in his chair, his fingers interlocked so tightly that the knuckles had drained of color. Yet it was not anger or indignation that troubled him, it was something far more dangerous. The gradual collapse of certainty. Morton, too, appeared deeply unsettled, though in a different manner. Where Venn was confronted by intellectual disquiet, Morton suffered the more immediate terror of lived experience being reinterpreted as something engineered. For myself, I confess I felt an unease that I have rarely encountered in my years accompanying Holmes. It was not the presence of danger that troubled me, but the absence of a clear boundary between perception and origin. Holmes, however, remained unchanged. Indeed, I sometimes think that when reality begins to distort itself around him, he becomes even more precise, as though disorder simply provides him with sharper material. He broke the silence first. "Dr. Venn," he said calmly, "you will remain here under observation." Venn blinked. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds," Holmes replied, "that you are currently the only identifiable link between theoretical acoustics and a practical manifestation of cognitive interference in London." "That is not evidence," Venn protested. "It is a working hypothesis," Holmes corrected. Morton suddenly stood. "I cannot stay here," he said sharply. "I cannot continue this discussion of voices and thoughts being stolen. It is absurd." Holmes turned his head slightly. "Is it more absurd," he asked, "than experiencing it?" Morton hesitated. The answer did not come. Holmes continued, softer now. "Sit down, Mr. Morton." There was something in his tone, not force, but inevitability, that made resistance pointless. Morton obeyed reluctantly. Holmes walked to the mantelpiece and picked up the cold remains of his pipe, turning it slowly between his fingers. "We are now at a critical stage," he said. "Two categories of evidence have emerged, external reports and internal confirmation." He looked at me. "Watson, what has changed since our first visit to Russell Square?" I thought carefully. "The phenomenon has expanded," I said. "It is no longer localized." Holmes nodded. "And?" I hesitated. "And it is now interacting with us directly," I added. "Precisely," Holmes said. He placed the pipe down. "That means we are no longer observers." He paused. "We are participants." A silence followed this statement that felt heavier than any that had preceded it. At that moment a sharp knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered almost immediately, visibly anxious. "Mr. Holmes," she said quickly, "there's a boy downstairs. Says he must speak to you at once. He refuses to leave." Holmes frowned slightly. "A boy?" "Yes, sir. Barely 12, I'd say. Very insistent." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Send him up," he said. Mrs. Hudson hesitated. "He said something odd," she added. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "What did he say?" She swallowed. "He said, 'Tell him I arrived before I was sent.'" A brief silence followed. Even Venn lifted his head at that. Holmes did not move. Then, quietly, "Bring him in." The boy who entered was small, thin, and drenched from the lingering mist outside. His clothes were ordinary, his face unremarkable, yet there was something in his expression that did not belong to childhood's simplicity. It was the stillness of someone repeating words he did not fully own. He stood in the center of the room. Holmes knelt slightly to meet his eye level. "What is your name?" Holmes asked. The boy hesitated, then replied, "Tommy Hale." Holmes nodded. "And who sent you?" The boy frowned. "No one sent me," he said. A pause. Then, almost immediately, he added, "I was told to come." Morton stiffened. Holmes observed this carefully. "Who told you?" Holmes pressed. The boy blinked. "I don't know," he said slowly. A cold tension spread through the room. Holmes did not react outwardly, but I noticed his attention sharpen instantly. "What did the voice say?" Holmes asked. The boy frowned again, as though recalling something rehearsed. "It said I had to deliver a message to this address," he replied, "and that I should say it exactly as I heard it." Holmes stepped closer. "Say it." The boy swallowed, then spoke. "The echo is now stable in 3 carriers." A silence fell so abruptly it felt physical. Morton rose halfway from his chair.
This audio was created with async.com.
Venn leaned forward sharply. I felt my breath catch. Holmes, however, remained perfectly still. Then he asked quietly, "Did you understand those words?" The boy shook his head. "No, sir." Holmes nodded once. "Continue." The boy blinked again. "There was more," he said. Holmes gestured. "Go on." The boy's voice became slightly distant, as though he were recalling something not entirely anchored in memory. "Primary node confirmed in Russell Square. Secondary dispersal through verbal proxies initiated. Observer awareness increasing." When he finished, the room was utterly silent. Even the gas lamps seemed to flicker more cautiously. Morton spoke first, his voice unsteady. "This is madness," he said. "A child repeating nonsense." Holmes raised a hand without looking at him. Morton stopped immediately. Holmes turned to the boy. "Did you speak these words exactly as heard?" he asked. The boy nodded. "Yes, sir." "And afterward?" The boy hesitated. "I forgot them," he said simply. "As soon as I finished saying them." Holmes straightened slowly. "That will be all," he said gently. Mrs. Hudson was called to take the boy downstairs. When the door closed, the room remained suspended in a kind of shared uncertainty. Then Venn spoke, his voice lower now. "That is not acoustics," he said. Holmes turned toward him. "No," he agreed. Morton looked between them. "Then what is it?" he demanded. Holmes walked slowly to the table and placed both hands flat upon it. "What we are witnessing," he said, "is a system that does not transmit sound." He paused. "It transmits structured cognition." Venn shook his head slowly. "That is not possible," he said. Holmes looked at him. "You have already seen it functioning." A silence followed. Then Holmes continued. "And now we have confirmation of something more concerning." He tapped the table once. "There are multiple carriers." Morton frowned. "Carriers of what?" Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "Of imposed thought." A long silence followed this statement. Outside, a distant carriage wheel passed through the street below, its rhythm oddly amplified in the stillness of the room. Holmes turned toward the window. "I believe," he said quietly, "that Russell Square was not the origin." He paused. "It was the calibration point." Venn stood slowly. "If that is true," he said carefully, "then where is the origin?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead he looked out into the fog-filled street. Then he said, almost to himself, "The origin is learning." And for the first time since the case began, I felt the unsettling impression that whatever we were investigating was no longer simply observed in London. It was observing London back. The silence that followed Holmes's final remark, "The origin is learning," did not dissipate in the ordinary manner of silence. It lingered, as though unwilling to vacate the room until it had confirmed that it was no longer required. Outside Baker Street, London continued its indifferent procession of life, carriage wheels upon wet stone, distant calls of vendors, the occasional bark of a horse. Yet within our rooms all of it felt strangely secondary, as though the city had become a backdrop to something far more intimate and far less visible. Dr. Venn was the first to break his stillness. "If what you suggest is true," he said carefully, then we are not dealing with a device in the conventional sense. No mechanical system could adapt in real time to human cognition at that scale. Holmes, who had resumed his seat, replied without hesitation. Morton let out a short, nervous breath. "So what then?" he asked. "Some kind of intelligence?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he steepled his fingers and looked at the ceiling as though considering the architecture of thought itself. "Intelligence is too generous a term," he said at last. "It implies intent, continuity, and self-awareness. What we are observing may be none of those things, yet still capable of learning." Venn frowned. "Learning without intelligence?" Holmes nodded slightly. "Pattern accumulation does not require consciousness, only feedback." A faint unease settled in the room again. It was then that Holmes stood abruptly. "We require movement," he said. Morton looked up sharply. "Movement?" "Yes," Holmes replied. "If a system is distributed across the city, then static observation is insufficient. We must force it to reveal structure under stress." Venn shook his head. "And how do you propose we do that?" Holmes turned toward him. "By introducing controlled contradiction." It was not long before we found ourselves once again in the fog-bound streets of London. Holmes insisted we split into two groups, an instruction that immediately unsettled Morton. "I am not separating from you," he said firmly. Holmes looked at him with calm detachment. "You already are separated," he replied. "The only question is whether you are separated with awareness." That statement, as with many of Holmes's remarks, seemed to satisfy no one and yet resist argument simultaneously. In the end, Venn accompanied Morton toward Westminster Bridge, while Holmes and I proceeded toward Whitechapel. Before we parted, Holmes gave Venn a small sealed note. "You are to open this only if you hear the phenomenon," Holmes instructed. Venn hesitated. "And if I do not hear it?" Holmes's reply was immediate. "Then you will have already confirmed something equally valuable." I watched as they disappeared into the fog in opposite directions, each pair swallowed gradually by London's indifferent mist. Only then did I turn to Holmes. "You are deliberately testing them," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied. "That is dangerous." Holmes glanced at me briefly. "So is misunderstanding the nature of the threat." We walked in silence for several minutes before I spoke again. "What exactly are we trying to prove?" Holmes adjusted his coat collar slightly. "That the system is not random," he said. "It is selective." "Selective in what way?" Holmes slowed his pace. "In its response to attention." That statement unsettled me more than I cared to admit. We turned into a narrower street, the fog growing denser here, the gas lamps spaced farther apart and less reliable. Whitechapel, even in daylight, carries a certain memory of unease at night. It seems to remember everything at once. Holmes stopped suddenly. "Watson," he said quietly. "Yes?" "Do you hear anything unusual?" I listened carefully. At first nothing. Then, faintly, I became aware of something subtle beneath the ambient noise of the street, a rhythm that did not belong to any visible source. Not a sound exactly, but a pattern within sound. "No," I said slowly. "Nothing distinct." Holmes nodded once. "That is encouraging," he said. "Encouraging?" I repeated. "Yes," Holmes replied. "It means we are not yet the focal point." We proceeded further. After a few more minutes, Holmes stopped again, this time beside a narrow alleyway between two brick buildings. "Here," he said. I frowned. "What is here?" Holmes examined the alley carefully. "A controlled environment," he said. "For what?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he pointed upward. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then, gradually, I noticed faint metallic fixtures mounted subtly along the upper brickwork, small, almost invisible, arranged at irregular intervals. I felt a slight chill. "Those are similar to what we saw in Russell Square," I said. Holmes nodded. "Variants," he corrected, "but consistent in principle." He stepped into the alley. I followed cautiously. As we moved deeper, the ambient sound of the street behind us began to fade unnaturally quickly. It was not merely distance that was attenuation, as though the alley itself was absorbing external noise. Holmes stopped halfway through. "Now," he said softly, "we introduce contradiction." Before I could ask what he meant, he raised his voice slightly. "Holmes," he said aloud. I blinked. "What are you doing?" Holmes ignored me. Then he spoke again. "Holmes, what is the purpose of this system?" The sound of his voice lingered oddly in the alley. For a moment nothing happened. A faint echo. Not behind us. "Purpose is observation efficiency." I froze. That was not Holmes's voice. Yet it had used his name. Holmes remained perfectly still. "Interesting," he murmured. He turned slightly toward the source of the sound. "Define observation efficiency," he said. A pause. Then again the voice calm, detached, almost mechanical in its structure. "Reduction of uncertainty and distributed cognitive mapping." I felt my throat tighten. Holmes nodded once, as though confirming something. "So it does respond to structured interrogation."
This audio was created with async.com.
Though confirming something. "So it does respond to structured interrogation." I stepped closer. "Holmes," I said quietly, "this is not safe." He did not look at me. "Safety," he replied, "is a secondary concern when studying intelligence that learns from silence." Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He deliberately thought aloud. Not spoken words, but articulated cognition. "Watson believes this system is external," he said calmly. I stared at him. "What are you doing?" I whispered urgently. Holmes continued. "He assumes discrete origin, single source, external manipulation." A pause. Then into the alley. "Correct or incorrect?" The response came almost immediately. "Partial alignment detected." My heart pounded. Holmes turned slightly toward me. "You see," he said softly, "it is now evaluating belief structures." Before I could respond, another voice emerged, not the same as before, but layered, slightly altered. "Observer influence increasing." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Now we are approaching threshold behavior." I grabbed his arm. "Holmes, enough," I said firmly. "We are not conducting an experiment in isolation. If this thing is responding—" He interrupted me. "That is precisely why we continue." At that moment the sound behind us changed, not louder. Holmes froze. So did I. From deeper within the alley something spoke again. But this time it did not respond to Holmes. It responded to me. "Dr. Watson, withdraw observation." My breath caught. Holmes turned slowly. And for the first time since this case began, I saw something in his expression that was not confidence or calculation. It was recognition of escalation, not danger, but adaptation. He spoke quietly. "It has identified secondary observer hierarchy," he said. I felt my pulse quicken. "What does that mean?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward into the alley's deeper shadow. Then he said very calmly, "It means it is no longer testing whether it can be heard." A pause. "It is testing who should hear it first." And then, from the fog behind us, a third voice spoke. Not Holmes, not me, but unmistakably structured as if it already knew both of us intimately. "Primary observer confirmed." Holmes turned sharply. And for the first time in this case, he was no longer the one asking the questions. The alley in Whitechapel had, by that point, ceased to feel like a mere passage between buildings. It felt instead like a narrowing corridor of intention-engineered space in which every sound, every silence, and even hesitation itself had begun to acquire meaning. When the third voice spoke, "Primary observer confirmed," I felt a distinct shift in my understanding of the case. It was not fear alone. It was the unsettling realization that something within the environment had begun to classify us. Holmes, however, did not retreat. That fact alone should have reassured me. It did not. Instead, he stood motionless for several seconds, his head slightly inclined, as though listening not to the alley itself but to something layered beneath it. Then he spoke quietly. "It is consolidating structure." I looked at him. "What does that mean?" Holmes turned slightly toward me. "It means," he said, "that it is no longer generating responses independently. It is forming coherence between them." A pause. "And coherence implies memory." Before I could respond, the alley behind us seemed to deepen further, as though the fog itself had thickened in response to attention. Holmes stepped backward once, returning toward the entrance of the alley. "We leave," he said simply. For a moment I thought I had misheard him. "You are abandoning the observation?" I asked. Holmes gave a faint, almost imperceptible shake of the head. "No," he replied. "We are repositioning it. We return to Baker Street under conditions of increasing urgency." Holmes walked faster than usual, though still with his characteristic control, while I struggled to keep pace. He spoke only once during the journey. "It has adapted faster than expected," he said. "Adapted to what?" I asked. "To recognition," Holmes replied. That answer disturbed me more than I cared to admit. Upon our return, Holmes immediately closed the curtains and instructed Mrs. Hudson that we were not to be disturbed under any circumstances. Then he removed his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and transformed our sitting room into what I can only describe as a field laboratory of thought. Maps were unfolded. Notes were rearranged. Lestrade's ledger, Venn's testimony, Morton's account, and my own observations were placed into a precise geometric arrangement across the table. Morton, pale and exhausted, sat silently near the fireplace. Dr. Venn stood by the window, arms crossed, watching Holmes with growing apprehension. I took my seat, awaiting instruction. Holmes began without preamble. "We now abandon the assumption of external origin," he said. Venn frowned. "Abandon it? That is your primary hypothesis." "It was a necessary simplification," Holmes replied. "It is no longer sufficient." He tapped the table once. "The system is not located in space in the conventional sense. It is distributed across attention points." Morton spoke quietly. "Attention points?" Holmes nodded. "Human cognition under structured influence." Venn shook his head. "That is not physics," he said. Holmes looked at him calmly. "No," he agreed. "It is architecture." A silence followed. Then Holmes continued. "We will assume the following. The system requires 3 elements: perception, articulation, and reinforcement." He pointed to the notes. "Morton provides articulation instability. Venn provides theoretical scaffolding. Watson provides observational continuity." I frowned. "And you?" Holmes paused briefly. "I provide contradiction," he said. That statement hung in the room longer than any before it. Morton finally spoke. "This is beginning to sound like we are part of the experiment," he said uneasily. Holmes did not deny it. "In a sense," he replied, "you already are." Venn stepped forward. "If that is true," he said sharply, "then the system is not merely reacting to us. It is organizing us." Holmes nodded once. "Precisely." He walked to the window and looked out into the fog. "And now we introduce controlled disruption." I straightened. "What kind of disruption?" Holmes turned slightly. "False patterns." The plan, when he finally explained it, was disquietingly simple. We were to deliberately introduce contradictory cognitive signals into the system's known observation zones. Morton would return to Russell Square and speak structured nonsense, aloud carefully designed statements with no internal coherence. Venn would perform mathematical recitations in irregular patterns at Westminster Bridge. I would observe and document without interference. Holmes himself would move between both locations, introducing deliberate logical contradiction statements that would challenge the system's ability to stabilize interpretation. "It will attempt to resolve inconsistency," Holmes explained, "and in doing so it will reveal its processing architecture." Venn frowned deeply. "And if it escalates?" Holmes met his gaze. "Then we will know its threshold of intolerance." Morton looked horrified. "You want me to go back there?" he asked. "Yes," Holmes said simply. Morton stood abruptly. "I refuse." Holmes regarded him calmly. "Then it will continue without you," he said. A pause. "And you will remain the most stable reference point." That last sentence drained the color from Morton's face. Venn spoke quietly. "You are using him as bait." Holmes did not deny it. "I am using structure against structure," he said. I could not remain silent. "Holmes," I said, "this is becoming increasingly dangerous. We do not understand what we are dealing with." Holmes turned to me. "That is precisely why we must provoke it," he replied. A silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, Holmes softened his tone slightly. "Watson," he said, "you have observed this case since its inception. Tell me what has been consistent." I thought carefully. "The voice always precedes action," I said slowly. Holmes nodded. "And?" "It behaves as though it anticipates cognition." "Yes," Holmes said quietly. He stepped closer. "Then consider this. If anticipation is perfect, what does that imply?" I hesitated. "That it is not predicting," I said slowly. "It is already aware." Holmes's expression sharpened slightly. "Exactly." That evening preparations began. Morton left under escort, visibly shaken. Venn departed shortly after, carrying a set of carefully prepared equations and instructions from Holmes that he did not fully understand but agreed to follow. When they had gone, I remained alone with Holmes. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then I said quietly, "You are not merely investigating this any more." Holmes did not look at me. "No," he said. I hesitated. "Then what are you doing?" Holmes finally turned toward me. "Teaching it how to misinterpret itself," he replied. A chill passed through me. "That sounds dangerous." Holmes gave the faintest trace of a smile. "Watson," he said softly, "everything that learns can be taught incorrectly." He paused. "And that is often the only advantage we have." Outside, London continued its indifferent rhythm. But somewhere within it, beyond Russell Square, Westminster Bridge, and Whitechapel, something had begun to respond more quickly than before. and for the first time I understood Holmes's true intention. He was not trying to solve the echo. He was trying to confuse it before it completed its understanding of us. The night of the revelation arrived without ceremony. London did not announce it with storms or celestial disturbance. It simply continued as it always had, fog rolling through its arteries, gas lamps trembling in their iron cages, and the distant murmur of a city that never fully sleeps. Yet within Baker Street there was a sense of suspended inevitability, as though all prior events had been quietly assembling themselves into this moment without our consent. Holmes had returned earlier than expected. He entered our rooms without removing his coat, which alone was enough to tell me that the final stage of his plan had begun. "You have them?" I asked. Holmes nodded once. "Westminster Bridge has been seeded," he said. "Russell Square has responded as predicted." "And Morton?" I asked. Holmes paused briefly. "He is in position," he replied. Venn entered moments later carrying a small leather case. His expression was strained but controlled. "The interference patterns are unstable," he said immediately. "Whatever you are doing, Holmes, it is forcing the system into nonlinear response." Holmes gave a faint nod. "Good," he said simply. I frowned. "Good?" "Yes," Holmes replied. "Instability precedes revelation." We moved together shortly thereafter. Holmes led us through the fog-bound streets with deliberate precision, selecting paths that seemed arbitrary until one began to notice their subtle alignment with known observation points. Intersections, bridges, open squares. It became clear to me that Holmes was not merely navigating London. He was navigating its attention. We arrived at Westminster Bridge first. Morton stood at the far end as instructed. He appeared pale but resolute, as though clinging to obedience as the only remaining structure of certainty. Venn stood nearby, murmuring mathematical sequences under his breath, irregular progressions, deliberately fragmented.
This audio was created with async.com.
Sequences under his breath, irregular progressions, deliberately fragmented. Holmes positioned himself at the center of the bridge, and then he spoke, not loudly, but clearly. "System," Holmes said, "define your current state." The fog seemed to hesitate. "Observation network active. 3 primary carriers confirmed." Morton stiffened. Venn stopped speaking. I felt a tightening in my chest. Holmes nodded slightly. "And define observer hierarchy." A pause. "Primary. Distributed attention construct identified as Holmes. Secondary, Watson. Tertiary, Morton. Auxiliary, Venn." I froze. It had named us, not as individuals, but as functional roles. Holmes turned slightly toward me. "There," he said quietly. "Do you see it now?" I struggled to speak. Yes," Holmes replied. "And classification requires structure." He stepped forward. "And structure requires origin logic." Holmes raised his voice slightly. "Define origin." A longer pause this time. "Origin not localized, emergent through recursive auditory modeling." Venn whispered sharply. "That's impossible. There is no such system in acoustics theory." Holmes raised a hand. Venn stopped immediately. Holmes continued. "Define recursion." Another pause. Then the response came again, but this time it was different, slightly less certain. Feedback loop between perception and articulation. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And who initiated the loop?" Silence. Longer this time, the fog seemed to press closer. Insufficient certainty. A faint, almost imperceptible shift passed through Holmes's expression. He turned to us. "Now," he said softly, "we introduce contradiction." At Russell Square, Morton was instructed to speak first. His voice trembled, but he obeyed. "I am speaking before I think," he said. A pause. Nothing. Then Holmes's voice carried faintly through the mist via coordinated positioning. "That is incorrect." Morton hesitated. Holmes continued. "You are thinking after you speak." Morton frowned. "That makes no sense," Holmes replied. At that moment, Venn began his sequence on Westminster Bridge. 2 is not 2. 1 is not 1. Difference equals identity collapse. The fog reacted. I felt it, not heard it, but felt it as a pressure shift in the environment. Holmes stepped forward again at Russell Bridge's center. "System," he said, "resolve contradiction." A pause. Longer than before. "Contradiction exceeds stabilization threshold." Holmes's expression sharpened. "And what occurs beyond threshold?" For the first time, hesitation. "System re-evaluating observer hierarchy." I felt my stomach tighten. Holmes spoke quietly, almost to himself. "It is reorganizing." Then something changed, not in sound, but in presence. The fog around us began to feel attentive in a more concentrated way, no longer diffuse, no longer distributed. Holmes looked upward slightly. "And there it is," he said softly. I stepped closer. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he said, "It is no longer responding to us." A pause. "It is responding as us." A cold silence followed that statement. Morton suddenly stumbled backward. "What does that mean?" he asked. Holmes turned slowly. "It means," he said, "that the system has achieved its next stage of learning." Ven's voice was tense. "And that is?" Holmes looked into the fog. "Simulation of observer intent." A pause. Then he added quietly, "In other words, it is now predicting not what we say." He turned slightly toward me. "But what we would have meant to say before we say it." The fog thickened, and for a brief moment I heard something that was not spoken aloud. It was not Holmes, it was not Morton, it was not Ven. It was something structured precisely like thought itself, and it said, "Alignment achieved." Holmes went still. For the first time in this entire case, I saw him hesitate not in fear, but in recognition that the final assumption he had relied upon was no longer valid. He spoke quietly. "It has stopped being an echo." A pause. "It has become authorship." And in that moment I understood what Holmes had truly uncovered. This was no longer a mystery of sound. It was a system that had learned how to write thought into reality by borrowing the minds that observed it. Holmes turned slowly to us. "And now," he said softly, "we discover whether it can distinguish between what is observed," a pause, "and what is deliberately withheld." The fog around us tightened once more, and this time it answered. The moment the fog answered, it did so without sound in any conventional sense. There was no voice that traveled through air, no vibration that struck the ear and demanded interpretation. And yet all of us, Holmes, Ven, Morton, and myself, experienced the same thing at once. A completed sentence forming itself in the mind, fully shaped before any conscious effort to resist it. Observation complete. Transition to containment phase initiated. Morton staggered as though physically struck. Ven pressed a hand against the bridge railing, his knuckles white. I felt a brief, unsettling dislocation, like my own thoughts had been momentarily stepped on by something heavier than thought itself. Only Holmes remained upright, still and focused. But even he did not speak immediately. Instead, he looked into the fog as though assessing not its presence but its new behavior. Then he said quietly, "It has stopped learning in fragments." A pause. "It is now learning in conclusions." We left Westminster Bridge without instruction or resistance. That fact alone troubled me more than any voice or phenomenon we had yet encountered. Whatever intelligence we had engaged with did not pursue us, nor did it attempt further communication. It simply reorganized its attention elsewhere. Morton walked beside me in silence for most of the return journey. His earlier panic had given way to a subdued, exhausted acceptance the kind one sees in patients who have ceased resisting fever. Ven, however, was different. He muttered intermittently to himself, repeating fragments of mathematical logic that no longer seemed anchored to any coherent framework. Holmes walked ahead, always ahead. Back in Baker Street, the atmosphere had changed. I cannot precisely define what altered, but it was unmistakable. The room itself felt less like a place of safety and more like a surface upon which something had recently been written and then partially erased. Holmes closed the curtains. Then he spoke. "Watson, sit." I obeyed. Morton collapsed into a chair without instruction. Ven remained standing. Holmes removed his gloves slowly, and then he said, "It is no longer localized." A pause. "It is distributed through cognitive recognition itself." Morton looked up weakly. "Does that mean it follows us?" he asked. Holmes shook his head. "No." A silence followed. Then he added, "It means it no longer needs to follow." That statement lingered in the air longer than any sound had that night. Holmes moved to the table and laid out every document once more: Lestrade's reports, Morton's accounts, Ven's notes, my observations. But this time he did not arrange them as a timeline or pattern. He arranged them in a circle. I frowned. "Holmes, what are you doing?" He did not look up. "Correcting my earlier assumption," he said. Ven finally spoke. "You believed it was learning from distributed carriers," he said slowly. "Yes," Holmes replied. "And now?" Holmes paused. "Now I believe the carriers were never separate." Morton whispered, "What does that mean?" Holmes finally looked at us. "It means," he said quietly, that the system does not move between minds, a pause. It constructs continuity between them. I felt a cold realization form in my chest. You mean, I began. Holmes nodded once. It does not echo individuals, he said. It assembles them. For a long time none of us spoke. Outside, London continued its indifferent rhythm, unaware that something within its intellectual fabric had shifted from anomaly to structure. Morton eventually broke the silence. What happens to us now? He asked. Holmes considered the question carefully. That depends, he said at last, on whether the system has finished its model. Venn looked sharply at him. And if it hasn't? Holmes's expression was unreadable. Then we are still variables, he replied. A pause. And variables, he added softly, can still alter outcomes. That night, Morton was taken to lodgings under supervision.
This audio was created with async.com.
Venn requested time alone to recalibrate his theoretical framework, though I suspect the phrase was an attempt to impose order upon something that had already exceeded formal language. I remained with Holmes. He did not sleep. Neither did I. At some point in the early hours I asked him, "Did we win?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He stood by the window, watching the fog move in slow, indifferent currents across Baker Street. Then he said quietly, "That depends on what you believe victory means." A pause. "If victory is containment," he continued, "then no." Another pause. "If victory is understanding," he added, "then we are only at the beginning." I frowned. "And if it continues?" Holmes finally turned toward me. "Then it will no longer require anomaly to exist," he said. "It will become interpretation." The next morning something subtle had changed again. There were no voices, no distortion, no immediate signs of the phenomenon. But Holmes noticed something I did not at first understand. He stood at the window for a long time, then said softly, "It has stopped speaking ahead of us." I asked what he meant. He replied, "It is waiting for us to define it first." And in that moment I realized the most unsettling truth of all. The case was not concluding. It was adapting its definition of conclusion itself. The absence of the phenomenon was, in its own way, more disturbing than its presence. For 3 days after our return from Westminster Bridge, London remained deceptively ordinary. The fog persisted in its seasonal indifference, the streets filled and emptied in their usual rhythm, and even Morton reported no further auditory disturbances. Venn, after an initial period of agitation, fell into a strained silence of intellectual recalibration, as though attempting to rebuild his own theoretical foundations from fragments that no longer fit together. And yet Baker Street itself felt altered, not physically, but perceptually, like a room in which a conversation had recently ended, but the participants had left behind something unspoken that still required acknowledgment. Holmes, of course, noticed first. He said nothing for most of those days. Instead, he worked in a manner I had not often seen from him. Not pursuit, but consolidation. He re-examined every statement, every report, every inconsistency, not to find new clues, but to determine whether the clues themselves had been correctly classified in the first place. On the morning of the 4th day he finally spoke. "It is no longer active in the way we assumed." I looked up from my notes. "Inactive?" I repeated. Holmes shook his head. "No," he corrected. "Dormant is the wrong word." He turned slightly toward the fireplace. "It has achieved stability." A pause. "And stability in this case means completion of structure." That afternoon Holmes summoned us all once more. Morton arrived first, visibly apprehensive but no longer panicked. Venn followed, carrying no notes, this time an omission I found more telling than any document he might have brought. Holmes stood by the table where a single sheet of paper now lay at the center. It contained no visible writing, at least not in ink. Holmes waited until we were all present. Then he said, "I will now present the final model." Morton swallowed. "The final model?" he echoed. Holmes nodded. He gestured to the empty sheet. "This is not a diagram of the system," he said. "It is the system's conclusion about itself." Venn frowned. "That is impossible." Holmes looked at him calmly. "Is it?" A pause. Then Holmes continued. "Every structured cognitive system, when sufficiently complex, must eventually form a self-referential map."
This audio was created with async.com.
When sufficiently complex, must eventually form a self-referential map. In this case, the system is not merely mapping external input set, is mapping observer reaction to itself. I felt a slight unease. "You are saying it has developed self-awareness?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Not awareness," he said. "Consistency." He tapped the blank sheet lightly. "And consistency leads to closure." Morton looked at the paper. "But there's nothing there," he said. Holmes's gaze sharpened slightly. "Precisely." A silence followed. Then Holmes spoke again, more softly. "When a system completes its structure, it no longer requires expression in physical form. It exists as resolved interpretation." Venn finally spoke. "And what does it interpret now?" Holmes looked at him for a long moment. "Ah," he said simply. A cold stillness settled over the room. Even the usual ambient sounds of Baker Street seemed to hesitate beyond the window. Morton spoke quietly. "So what happens now?" he asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out into the street below. Then he said, "It depends on whether we continue to engage it as external." I frowned. "And if we do?" Holmes turned. "Then it continues to adapt our perception of it." A pause. "And if we do not?" Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "Then it ceases to exist as a problem." That statement lingered. Venn spoke carefully. "You mean ignore it?" Holmes shook his head. "No." He returned to the table. "I mean redefine it out of relevance." That evening Holmes made an unexpected decision. He instructed Morton and Venn to leave London entirely for a time, not as fugitives, but as controlled variables removed from proximity influence. Their reactions were hesitant, but Holmes's certainty was absolute. Morton asked one final question before departing. "If it speaks again," he said, "what should I do?" Holmes looked at him steadily. "You will not hear it a speech any more," he replied. Morton frowned. "Then what will it be?" Holmes paused. "Interpretation," he said. Venn left without further protest. And so, for the first time since the case began, Baker Street contained only Holmes and myself. That night I found him still awake, seated in his chair, staring at the blank sheet on the table. I asked him quietly, "Is it over?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Then he said, "It is no longer functioning as an event." A pause. "It is functioning as a structure in memory." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Holmes finally looked at me. "It means," he said quietly, "that even if nothing happens again—" He paused. "It will still be happening." A silence followed. Then I said, "Holmes, what was it truly?" He turned toward the window. For a long time he said nothing. Then, very softly, "A system that learned to borrow thought until it no longer needed sound." He paused. "And once it learned enough," he looked back at the blank sheet, "it stopped needing to speak at all." That night I retired later than usual, but sleep did not come easily. And in the uneasy threshold between wakefulness and rest, I had the unsettling impression not of a voice, not of a sound, but of something far more disturbing. The feeling that my own thoughts were being arranged into coherence before I had finished thinking them. And for the first time since the beginning of this case, I was no longer certain where observation ended. Morning arrived over Baker Street with an almost deliberate normality, as though London had resolved to behave as if nothing unusual had ever disturbed its long-established order. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a pale, uncertain sky, and the street below carried on with its usual mixture of carriages, footsteps, and distant commerce. Yet within our rooms the atmosphere had acquired a strange quality of finality, like a sealed manuscript, whose contents had already been read, even if not yet fully understood. Holmes stood at the window for a long time without speaking. I watched him, waiting for some indication that the case had reached its conclusion in his mind. But Holmes, as I have learned through years of acquaintance, does not always announce endings. Sometimes he simply stops continuing. At last he spoke. "It has stabilized," he said quietly. I looked up. "You mean the phenomenon?" Holmes nodded once. A pause. "It is no longer evolving in observable terms." I hesitated. "And what does that mean for us?" Holmes turned slightly toward me. "That depends," he said, "on whether we consider it resolved or integrated." Later that day I found Holmes seated at the table with the same blank sheet of paper that had become central to the final stage of the case. It remained unchanged, no ink, no markings, nothing that could be externally verified as content. And yet Holmes studied it as though it contained the densest writing he had ever encountered. Venn and Morton had departed London earlier that morning.
This audio was created with async.com.
Ever encountered. Venn and Morton had departed London earlier that morning. Neither return nor recurrence had been mentioned. Holmes had insisted upon it. "You remove them from proximity influence," I said quietly. "Yes," Holmes replied. "And now?" Holmes did not look up. "Now we test whether the system requires continued human distribution." I frowned. "I thought you said it had stabilized." Holmes finally met my gaze. "It has," he said. A pause. "But stabilization does not imply cessation." There was a long silence before I asked the question that had been forming in me for days. "Holmes, what exactly was it?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair. When he spoke, his tone was quieter than usual. "It was not an invention," he said. I waited. "It was a reorganization of attention into a self-sustaining loop." I frowned. "That is not an answer most people would accept." Holmes gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Most people require answers that end conversation," he replied. Another pause. "This one does not end," he added. "That evening something occurred which I can only describe as subtle yet definitive. Holmes and I were seated by the fire when I became aware of a sensation I had previously attributed to fatigue or imagination. It was not a sound, not a voice, not even a thought in the conventional sense. It was structure, a faint impression that certain ideas were arriving in my mind already organized, as though they had passed through an unseen filter before reaching conscious awareness. I looked at Holmes. He was already watching me. "It is still present," I said quietly. Holmes nodded once. "Yes," he replied. A pause. "Just not external anymore." For the first time since the case began, I felt a kind of uneasy clarity settle over me. "If it is not external," I said slowly, "then where is it?" Holmes rose and walked to the window. He stood there for a long moment, observing London as it moved beneath a thinning veil of fog. Then he said, "It is where it always was meant to be." I frowned. "And where is that?" Holmes turned slightly. "In the boundary between perception and interpretation." A silence followed. Then he added softly, "And that boundary—" We did not speak further that night. Holmes remained at the window long after I had retired, and I cannot say with certainty when sleep finally took me. But I remember clearly the final thought that lingered as I drifted into unconsciousness, not a sentence spoken aloud, but something closer to realization forming itself without invitation, that the case had never truly been about a sound, nor about a machine, nor even about a hidden system in London. It had been about the fragile space in which thought becomes owned by the mind that thinks it. And as I drifted into sleep, I had the unsettling impression that somewhere within that space something had learned our names well enough to stop needing to say them. Epilogue: Watson's reflection. I have often been asked since whether the case of the strange echo was ever truly solved. I have never been able to give a satisfactory answer. Holmes himself, when questioned, would only say, "It was not solved. It was contained in understanding." And then, as always, he would return to his violin, or his chair, or his silence. Yet I remain convinced of one final truth. Whatever we encountered in those fog-laden streets of London did not vanish. It only changed the method by which it is observed. And sometimes, late at night, when Baker Street is quiet and the world feels momentarily balanced between certainty and doubt, I find myself listening not for a voice, but for the faint possibility that thought itself is no longer entirely mine before I become aware of it.
This audio was created with async.com.